The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody. If it's morning wherever you are, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Of course, this is Unit 1 of a 6 series, and a warm welcome to you all. I just want to make sure, I want to do a sound check. So those of you who, excuse me, those of you who are unfamiliar with this platform, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a little, there's a box called Questions. Could I just ask you to open that up and just type in the word clear? Just type in clear. That lets me know I'm coming across loud and clear. Otherwise, I end up talking to us. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mario. Okay, good. It sounds like it is coming across loud and clear, which is great. Now, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping to start with, just to explain, because this is obviously our first session or first unit. At the end of this, what happens is that I send you an email, and in the email there are two links. One will be for a recording of today's session, and also another link will be the slides. So obviously if you're here today, then you can go back and use those as a review. Or obviously if people aren't here, then they can go on and watch the video in their own leisure. I upload that to YouTube. Now, I mention that to you, even though you're here today, because if any stage during these 6 units that you can't make it for whatever reason, then you've got an opportunity, of course, to see the recording. Now, I try and send that out about 24 to 48 hours after our session, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And in that particular email, you'll also get the other 5 units. And if you haven't already registered for each of those 5, you need to do so. So it's just a case of clicking on the link for each of the units, typing your name in and your email address. Unfortunately, you can't do it just for one and then all 6 you've registered. It doesn't work that way because for all intents and purposes, there are actually 6 webinars which come together to join a series. So you're registering effectively for 6 webinars. So that's the logistics out of the way. The other thing that's important is that I like to make this as interactive as possible. And the way to do that, of course, is where you clicked on the question box and wrote the word clear. You can actually then just type in your question, comment, or observation at any stage during the broadcast. I will see it. In fact, I'm the only one that does get to see it, and I'll respond to it the moment I see it. So in other words, we don't have a sort of a 10-minute awkward pause at the end where people are sort of thinking about the questions they want to ask. They will be addressed the moment that you jot something in there. So don't be shy. If you've got a question, you want me to clarify something, or you've got a comment to make, or you want to back something up that I've said, then that's the place to do it. Now, the other element of this is that I set you homework at the end of each of these sessions. Now, it's not theoretical written homework, you'd be pleased to know, but it'll be about doing things. It'll be about actually trying things out with your team. And so you've got, basically these sessions happen fortnightly, so you'll get a chance to try some things out in that fortnight, and I encourage you to do so. Otherwise, it just becomes a very interesting exercise where you're not actually doing anything different as a result of what you've learned. So that becomes important as well, and I'll talk to you about that at the end of today's presentation. That's pretty much for me, but if anyone's got any other questions, then you know what to do. Go to the question box and type in your question. I'll happy to answer those as we go. All right. Now, of course, in this webinar, we've got people in the public sector, the private sector, and the not-for-profit sectors. And so it's a fairly generic group of people that we've got from all sorts of different sectors. Perhaps the one thing that you've got in common is that you are a team leader and have a team to lead. So obviously that's what this whole theme is about in this series of webinars. Okay, now what you're seeing on your screen now is the the order and the list of units that we're covering in the 6 sessions. So I'll just briefly review those and then we'll launch into Unit 1. I won't talk about Unit 1, but Unit 2, the next time we meet in a fortnight, we're going to talk about the 4 stages of team development. So if you've got a new team or you've been a team leader for a period of time, it's often a good idea to try and understand what stage that people are at in terms of the development of the team. So I'm going to share that with you and give you a chance, because there are certain things that you need to do to move your team on from the stage that they're at onto the next stage. And so this is using a good model of, you probably may have heard of it before, it's quite catchy. We've got forming, storming, norming, performing, and of course we all want our teams to be in that final stage of performing. In Unit 3, we're going to talk about tools for leading teams, and you've always got a balance between task and relationship. Obviously, you've got tasks to do. That's what your team is there for. There are certain things that have to be done. But at the same time, you've got to maintain good working relationships with all of your team members and ensure that each of them have reasonable working relationships with each of their team members as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some tools around how we do that in Unit 3. In Unit 4, we're going to look at the roles people play in teams, and I think I've got a very special guest speaker that I'll be bringing on board for that, who will look at the different roles that people play in teams. And we all do, beyond our technical role, that is the job that we're required to do on our job description. Each of us comes to a team with a certain role or set of roles. So I want to talk about that, and I'm going to use the team management profile as an opportunity to talk about that. In Unit 5, you're going to have a diagnostic to do for homework. So when I send out the email with the links, it'll ask you to complete a diagnostic. And what that diagnostic will tell you is what your preferred style of conflict is. So how you actually like to deal with conflict. Now, negotiation, of course, is a form of conflict because, you've got a difference of viewpoint that you've got to navigate through. So that diagnostic will show you your preferred style. And then the idea, of course, is to use the 5 styles that I'm going to share with you in Unit 5. So Unit 5 is pretty much a debrief around the diagnostic that I send you. And then Unit 6 is how to develop team culture. Now, all teams, no matter who they are or what they do, has a culture. So the question really becomes, am I happy with the culture? Is the culture actually helpful for the team? And how can we improve the culture and make it a more productive culture? So I'm going to talk about some skills around that as well. And that'll be pretty much it in terms of the Lunch and Learn. So I'm looking forward to working with you. And as I said before, be as interactive as you like, and type in your comments and questions in the question box there on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's move on to today's session. And today we're going to look at as I said, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, this comes from my own work, and I'm currently writing a book about this at the moment. So I'm going to share with you, obviously, what those 8 characteristics are. And while I'm doing that, I'd like you to have a think about, how your team's faring in each of those characteristics. I'm going to share some examples in fact, I'm going to actually get you to share some examples of high-performing teams. And we'll do that very shortly. So this might be in the sporting world or places that you know. And more importantly, I'm going to give you some tools to be able to create high-performing teams. So how can you give expression to each of these 8 characteristics that I'm going to share with you, and what can you do to make them more effective in terms of the team that you lead? So we're covered, and then we're finishing up at the top of the hour. Okay. So let me ask you a question, and what I'd like you to do is to type in your answer, and I'd like you to type in your answer in the question box. Could I ask you if you could identify for me some examples of high-performing teams in the world of sport? So could I just get you to type in the first thing that comes into your mind when you think about high-performing teams in the world of sport, what teams are you actually thinking about? So could I ask you to type in some examples, and I'll just wait for people to have a go at that, and then I'll respond. Okay, here we go. Yeah, the All Blacks. Yep, I totally agree with that, says Sharon. And in fact, interestingly enough, I'm writing a book about the All Blacks at the moment, and I'm looking at them as an exemplar. They are, without doubt, the most successful sporting team that's ever been. If you look at their win-loss ratio, it's something in the order of the high 70s or early 80%, which is phenomenal for any sporting team. And the interesting thing about the All Blacks is that they spend as much time off the field working on teamwork as they do on the field. Obviously, there's a high talent level in the team, so there's no question about the skill set that are in the All Blacks. There's no doubt about that, but that's not their competitive advantage. Their competitive advantage is the team culture that they've created off the field, and they work very hard at that and have spent considerable amounts of time on that. Has anyone got any other examples that they might want to share? The Indian cricket team, says Christopher. Yeah, look, I think we've just been through a series in Australia with the Indian cricket team. They're clearly a very good and well-run team, and again, a very high skill level, but they do some things that create, obviously, a team synergy in their team. So you're right on the money there, Chris. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, we've got the Firebirds here. Now, I don't know too much about the Firebirds other than I know that they're a netball team based in Brisbane. I know that they do very well in the national competition, but I'm not too familiar. It's not a game that I follow too closely, although one of my daughters plays netball, and we've often toyed with the idea of going along and watching the Firebirds play here in Brisbane, where I'm from. So I'll take your word for that, and Melissa, I'll take your word with the Firebirds. All right, so there are plenty of teams out there that we might call high performing. So what I want to do now is actually start looking at what these 8 characteristics are, and I'll give you a briefing on those. And then what we'll do is go through each of the characteristics in a little bit more detail. All right, so what you're seeing in front of you now is my model of the characteristics of high-performing teams. And the first thing that you'll notice about the model is that there are 8 characteristics, as I mentioned earlier. Now, there could be 9, there could be 10. If you got 4 out of the 8, you might be doing well. But at the end of the day, I have identified 8 areas that I believe are important. Now, the other thing you'll notice about the model that's quite interesting is that they are all interrelated. You'll notice that the figure in the middle does relate all of the different characteristics. So in other words, here's the good news. The good news is if you work on one of these characteristics with your team, it's likely to impact positively on other characteristics, right? That's good news. In other words, you don't have to sort of concentrate on all 8. You can concentrate on one. Let me give you an example. Obviously, if you build higher trust levels than would normally be the case in your team, then it's likely that you're going to actually have people sharing their ideas, and shared leadership is likely to be, or collaboration is likely to be, a characteristic of your team as a result of high trust levels. Or if you're agile, in other words, you're flexible and maneuverable and adaptable, it's likely that you are probably a team that are willing to, as it says there, renovate systems. In other words, you're looking at the ways and the way you do things and questioning whether it's a good way, whether there's a better way, or whatever. So you can see that they're all interrelated in some respects. And all of them, now the bad news is this. The bad news is if one of those characteristics is missing, in your team, it's likely to impact on other characteristics. So the bad news is you're going, say, for example, if you don't manage stakeholders very well. Okay, let's say that you don't manage stakeholders very well. Well, that's going to create a them and us type culture. Trust levels are going to go down, clearly, and you're not going to be too agile because you're going to be very defensive about the way you deal with your stakeholders. So you can see that they do all interrelate. And of course, for convenience sake, we're going to look at each of those individually today so that we can understand them. And your homework, as I mentioned earlier, will be to start to work on one of these characteristics in your team. And clearly, I'm going to give you the tools to do that and how you might do that. So let's just have a look at the list in front of you. So if you look at the list, you've got, starting at 12 o'clock, you've got pursuing purpose. Any high-performing team, regardless of whether it's in the sporting world or business or wherever, have got a very clear purpose of what they're there for, and they're very clear and focused on meeting that purpose. Now, obviously, in the sporting world, it's very easy to do that. It's about winning the game. But in our business world, in the world that we work in, of course, it's not quite so simple, because you've got a variety of different expectations about what your team are supposed to be doing. And you may have a certain view and others in the team may. So it's not so easy to do that, but we'll talk more about that later. And then moving clockwise, we've got managing stakeholders. Now, no team works in isolation completely. All teams have stakeholders. Some of those are internal to the organisation and some of them are external as well. So the idea is that managing stakeholders is critically important, because if you don't get the right information at the right time in the right way, it's likely that your team is going to be impacted in some way, in a negative way. So building alliances with stakeholders is critically important, and I'll talk a bit more about that too. Obviously, if you show me any high-performing team, I'll show you a team where people basically trust you and they trust each other. So there's above average levels of trust in a high performing team. Now, trust ebbs and flows, doesn't it? So, you can have, there can be one incident in your team that can destroy trust. And of course, it's very hard to get and very easy to lose. But of course, it's important to try and build that. Shared leadership is important, because what we want you to do is to try to utilize the thoughts and views and technical skills in your team to complete the tasks that are required of you. So that's critically important to be able to do that. And that's what we call shared leadership. Being agile is important because the world is changing so quickly out there that obviously your team needs to be able to flex and maneuver when it's required to do so. And if it's very bureaucratic and caught up in red tape and all sorts of things, it becomes very, very difficult to do that. I'm sure you'd agree. Renovating systems is being open to scrutinising how your systems operate, and that's really important. So, in other words, not just be completely beholden to to the processes and systems that you use, to be constantly scrutinising them, to be constantly reviewing them, to be constantly upgrading them is part of a high-performing team. And managing or utilising diversity is another characteristic. Now, when we talk about diversity, we often think immediately of ethnicity, and I suppose that is diversity, but there's another type of diversity too, and that's the way people think. So as I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, people have certain roles or ways of thinking or preferential ways of thinking when they come and work in a team. And we should recognise what they are, and Module 4 does look at that very carefully. So we'll spend a bit more time on that in detail in Module 4 or Unit 4. Now, any high-performing team is constantly learning. It's always learning. Both the individual team members and the team generally are always. So a typical example of that might be that you've completed a project you sit around and you review it. What went well, what didn't go well, and what could have been done better. So that's a learning process that teams can go through on reflection. So I think you'd all agree that they're the 8 values or 8 characteristics that are critically important to teams. And as I said, there may well be other ones, but certainly they're the 8 that I really wanted to concentrate on during this webinar. All right, so let's now go and look at each of them in a bit more detail. And what I'm going to show you, we're going to start with the first one here, which is sharing purpose. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, what I'm going to suggest here is that it's really important for you to set very clear expectations around your team. If I walked up to any of your team members, would they be able to tell me what your expectations are of them? Would they, and if they did tell me, would they gel with your expectations? In other words, would they be consistent with what you are saying? Would they pause before they gave an answer, or would they just blurt something out and it was spot on? So managing expectations as a team leader is around creating a sense of purpose. So let's actually have a look at this a little bit more deeply. Now, when you're creating expectations with your team, you actually have to address 7 questions. Now, not directly, but certainly indirectly. And what I'm going to do is share with you what those 7 questions are. And I want you to have a think about these 7 questions. If any of these questions can't be answered with a confident yes, then there's a reasonable chance that your expectations are not being clearly communicated and accepted by your team. Now, the most fundamental question that you need to ask in a team environment is, what are my expectations? So what are your expectations as a leader of your team? You need to be able to confidently answer that, because if you can't, then obviously all the other 6 questions are not going to come into play. So what I often say to team leaders is you don't have to get too complicated about this. You can just think, well, what are 2 or 3 key values that I believe in that are critically important for team success? And then you share them with your team in a team meeting, and what you do is you use them as an opportunity to review critical incidents and projects and so on that go on your team. So the very first fundamental step here is to be clear about what your expectations are. The second key question then is, obviously, if you've got your expectations, the next question is, have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, you might say, well, I did in one team meeting. This is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. It's something that can't be just done once. And I often call this is being persistent and consistent. So persistent in the sense that you're continually drumming into people what your expectations are, and consistent means not changing or varying those expectations, so that they're always consistent and they know, people know what's expected of them. So obviously, if you don't communicate them, people aren't mind readers. They're not going to work out what your expectations are. They might guess them, they might assume them, but until you've communicated them, they're never really going to be 100% sure. So that's the second big question around expectations. The third big question is, it's one thing to communicate it, but it's another thing for people to actually understand what those expectations mean. So, for example, if you said to people, I believe in teamwork, let's say that's a very strong expectation of yours. But what does that actually mean in reality? What does it actually mean in practice? Do people know what teamwork really means? Because teamwork can mean different things to different people. So the question then is, have you contextualized it? Do people actually understand how that expectation fits in with what they do? Very important. Now, often people won't say to you, I don't understand what your expectation is. They just give you a blank look, spin on their heels, and off they go. And you kind of think, well, they must get it. They must know. Well, of course, it's not always the case. So be clear about what you're expecting, communicate it, and communicate it in a way that people actually understand, which of course is not the end of the road. The fourth question that you've got to be able to address is, do my team members accept my expectations? So it's one thing to understand them, but it's another thing to accept them. So I've had people say to me, I understand your view about teamwork and everything else, but I'm not a team player. I just come to work, I do my job, whatever's on my job description, I get on and do it, and that's that. So they obviously don't accept it, even though they understand it. So, and if people don't accept your expectations, then the thing is they're not going to do it. They might understand it at one level, but they're not actually going to do it. So we want to get people to accept those expectations as fair and reasonable. And I'll talk a little bit about how you do that, which is tied up with the fifth question that you need to be able to address. The fifth question around this is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? So it's one thing accepting them. Are they 100% committed to meeting them? That's the other big challenge. Now, one of the easiest ways for you to do this is when you're working with one of your team members one-on-one, what you need to say to them is, when you've talked about something, you actually look them in the eye and you say, can I get your commitment on this? Can I get your commitment to complete the report by close of business today? Can I get your commitment to finish that task before you move on to the next? Can I get your commitment to treat our customer with respect, whatever it might be? That's a good question, because what you're actually after is a nod or a grunt or a yes. So if somebody nods or grunts or yes, then they've verbalized, well, not if they've nodded, but they have in some way signaled to you that they're committed to doing what it is that you and they have discussed. Now, there's no guarantee, of course, that they'll do it, because just, making a commitment and doing it is another thing. But I can guarantee to you that the chances of them doing it have gone up tenfold because you've got their commitment. We leaders sometimes assume that because we've given somebody some instructions or we've talked to them, we just think that they're going to go off and do it, or they're committed to it, or they understand it. So it's really important for you to stop there and actually verbally ask for people's commitment. And it's not pushy, it's a very reasonable thing. In fact, you can preface it by saying, this is so important, I really need to know that you can commit to this. Can I get your commitment on this? Nothing wrong with that, and I think it's a very good thing that you should do. So just because they're committed, surely that's the end of the road. Well, no, it's not. There are two more questions that you need to ask yourself in order for people to be able to meet your standards. One of those questions, number 6, is, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? What that means is that you should be giving regular feedback to your team members about whether or not they have met your commitments, met your expectations. So this could be positive feedback by thanking people or letting them know that you're really happy with the performance or whatever it is, or it could be negative feedback, as in you haven't met the crossbar, or you haven't met, my level of expectation on that, and explain why, and then talk to them about how you can help them meet that commitment next time. So giving regular feedback to your team members is critically important. And just because some people don't like negative feedback doesn't mean they don't need to hear it. So don't get confused by that. It is important for you to let people know where they stand. In fact, it's critically important. Now, the final question in this list is, am I supporting my team members to achieve these expectations? Now, there are lots and lots of roadblocks and barriers inside organisations that prevent people from meeting your expectations. For example, another manager pulls someone aside and wants them to go on and work on something else that you don't want them to work on, or they didn't get the right information from a source outside the team, so therefore they couldn't complete the report on time. Whatever it might be, your job as a team leader is to do whatever you can to remove any barriers that are in the way of people actually meeting your expectations. And you know what? Sometimes you won't. Sometimes it's just one of those things that get in the way that you have no control over, but at least you recognize that. But there is other times where you can get involved and do something about it. So you see, there are 7 very important questions around creating purpose. And you need to be able to address all of those questions in the positive in order for people to meet your expectations. So it's quite complex, isn't it? So it's just food for thought. Think about what you're not doing. And if people aren't meeting your expectations, ask yourself the question, which of these things am I not doing? Is it the fact that I haven't communicated it well enough? Is it the fact that they don't understand it? Is it the fact that they don't accept it? Is it the fact that they're not committed to it? Is it the fact that they don't know how they're performing? They actually think they're meeting the expectations, but they're not. Is it the fact that there are barriers in the way that I don't know about? So I think it's another way of being able to look at people and understand how they meet those expectations. All right, moving right along. So we're now going to move around clockwise around these 8 areas, and we're going to look at open information. Your job is to create an authentic, open dialogue with all of your team members and try to encourage that with people in your team. And the way to do this, of course, is to have meaningful conversations with people and regular conversations. The research tells us that there's a high correlation between the quality of conversations that people have in the team and morale. And so your job is to create a conversation environment. And I'm not talking about just sitting around chit-chatting. I'm talking about really meaningful conversations. And I have a framework here that I think you might find useful. I'm going to share it with you, that I think if you take this on board, you might be pleasantly surprised at how effective it works. It's called the 5 Conversations Framework. Now, the 5 Conversations Framework is really 5 short 10 to 15 minute conversations once a month with each team member. So I'm going to encourage you to actually, if you don't do it already, is to sit down with each of your team members every month and to have a conversation with them. Now, you don't have to worry about what you need to talk about because I've actually given it to you here in this slide. And if you do this, you'll be quite amazed at what it'll do in terms of opening up the channels of communication in your team. So let me just quickly give you a brief as to the 5 conversations that I put in this. And I put them down for various reasons. You can see over on the left-hand side, you've got months 1 through to 5. So clearly, as I mentioned, you have one of these conversations once a month. And then in the column in the middle, you've got the type of conversation. And then of course on the right-hand side, you've got the content, what that conversation actually looks like. So for example, in the first month, you have a climate review conversation. Now, as you could probably work out, climate's got nothing to do with the weather in this case. The climate review is really around job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So you actually have a conversation with people about those things. Now, why would you do that? Because you get a rain check on where people are at. Companies spend hundreds, if not thousands, and even tens of thousands of dollars doing engagement surveys online every year. And of course, people get very cynical about those things and nothing really changes and they don't bother giving a response the next year. My argument is that team leaders should just be sitting down having those conversations with people anyway. Now, people might say, well, I don't know whether people will be honest with me if I had a conversation with them, but who's to say they're actually honest when they complete it online anyway? So the very first question in the climate review conversation is simply this. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is high, 1 is low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, it doesn't matter what the person says, they might say 6. The next question is the important one, why? So why is the really important information, because it gives you a clue as to where people are at in terms of what they focus on and so forth. All right, so it's very rare I find that people give it 10 out of 10. And let's face it, job satisfaction, like trust, ebbs and flows. So 1 minute it's high, the next day it's low. So it's a nice, easy starting point to have a good conversation with your team members. Then in month 2, you have a strengths and talents conversation. Now, the strengths and talents conversation actually looks at what people are good at. Now, instead of going straight for the jugular, let's actually work out what people actually do well. And so the first question in there is, what do you enjoy about your work? Now, that's important because there's a high correlation we've found between what people actually enjoy doing and what they're good at. So instead of us going straight for what's your strength, and people balk and think, what are you talking about? Or I don't want to admit anything, or I don't have any strengths, or whatever they might say, a much easier way in is to say, what part of your work do you enjoy? Now, hopefully you'll get something back. What do you enjoy? And that gives you a clue as to what their innate talent is in the team, and just talk to them about it. And then in conversation 3, or the month 3, you talk about opportunities for growth. And I suggest that you ask people to come to that conversation having thought about that. What's one area you'd like to build or grow in? All right. Now, when they share that with you, listen intently and think about ways and means that you can assist them to do that, assuming, of course, you're both on the same page about that. Now, those conversations 2 and 3, strengths and talents and opportunities for growth, lead into conversation 4. So in month 4, the conversations are around learning and development. Now, it's likely out of conversation 2 and 3, there will be some learning opportunities that have been presented at those conversations. And now it's an opportunity to consolidate and to start to look at some of those. Now, by learning and development, I'm not necessarily meaning sending people off to training courses. I mean, that's part of it, but it's not the only way. We learn in lots of different ways. We learn by being coached. We learn by observing. We learn by buddying up with other people. We learn by having clear instructions. We learn in lots of different ways. So the learning and development conversation is really about building some sort of strategy and opportunity and support system to help people with their learning about the areas that they've identified in the previous 2 conversations. Now, the difference between conversation 4, learning and development, and conversation 5, innovation and continuous improvement, is that conversations about improving conversation 4 is about improving themselves, whereas conversation 5 is about improving their working environment. Big difference. So in conversation 5, you're asking people to bring to your conversation ways and means of improving the working environment they're in. Now, I want them to think about this, and I want them to contribute to this, and some of them may think that's your domain, but it's not. It's everybody's domain. So what you need to do is ask them those questions. Now, not everything that your team comes up with will be practical and implementable, but there will be some things that will be useful, and I guarantee to you, if you implement them, and they're easy to implement, if they are, you will find that that will do a huge amount to encourage people again to come forward with ideas about ways and means of making the workplace efficient and effective. Okay, so there's a framework that you can use, and it works really, really well. And I've had lots of success with this, and there are companies and organisations all over the world who are using this 5 conversations framework. All right, moving right along. Now, how do we build up trust? Well, there's a lot of elements to trust, and let me share with you some of those elements on this slide that will come up in a moment on your screen. Now, one of the things that let's try and summarize this and not make it too complicated. At the end of the day, if you want people to trust you, then you need to do a couple of really important things. One is you need to be an authentic human being. What I mean by that is just be yourself at work. You don't have to put on any airs and graces and try and pretend otherwise. If people know that you're authentic, you're a long, long way ahead. And the other thing I think that's really important with this is to be consistent, fair and consistent, if you like. So when you're giving feedback, make sure that you do it in a fair and consistent way. I think if you do those two things, you're a long way ahead. So be authentic and be consistent is probably the two messages that I'd have for you. So have a think about the trust levels in your team. Are they high? And if they are, why are they high? What are you actually doing to create that? Because you are obviously are. Or if they're low, which is a bit more confronting, what are you doing that might be rectified? What could you do to improve that? Now, the next area to look at is shared leadership. Now, this is a bit tricky for those of you who might be micromanagers, and we've always got a few, and sometimes people don't want to admit that, but what you and I have got to do is let go and allow other people to get involved in what they're doing in the team. Easier said than done. But there's a situational leadership, which is a model that Blanchard has put forward, which is this model here. I'm sure you've seen it before, but essentially what they're saying, they're calling it situational leadership, and they're arguing that different situations require different responses from the leader. And there's 4 different responses, as you can see. You can see there, you've got delegation, you've got supporting, coaching, and directing. So you've got 3 different responses, and you would use them at different times. So you wouldn't always be directive. It wouldn't be appropriate to always be directive. Likewise, you shouldn't always be supportive, because there are things that are required are different. And what the authors of this model have done is they've made it really easy for us by asking, what sort of team are you leading? So you can see down the bottom, you've got a chart that talks about the followers. And you can see that if you look at D4, for example, it says high competence and high commitment. So if you've got a team that's highly technically skilled and hugely motivated, all right, well, first of all, congratulations, because it's very rare for that to happen. But if that is the case, then clearly your leadership style should be around supporting and delegating. Why? Because the team are competent, they're going to get on with it, they believe in what they're doing, and your job then is to farm out work and to make sure that roadblocks and things are out of the way and people can get on with it. But on the other hand, if you look at the other end of the scale, D1, which is low competence and high commitment, all right, so this is where you've got a young team that aren't particularly technically competent in what they do, but they've got a great attitude. Now, if that's the case, then obviously you could use a different style of approach, which is more around the style of directing and coaching, because that's what they require from you. A lot of people say, new people in the workplace, young people, generation, whatever you call them, X or whatever, millennials, they don't like being directed. Well, the truth of the matter is it's how you go about directing them. And I mean, they do need direction. Why? Because they don't know. They don't know what they don't know. And they actually need clarity and direction. Now, you can do that aggressively, or you can do that with tact and dignity. It's really up to you. But at the end of the day, people who have no experience whatsoever actually need some clear direction, because they don't know. So don't think for a moment that, this myth that all millennials don't appreciate direction. Many of them do. Not only do they appreciate it, they need it. So I think that's important. I don't know if anyone's got any comment they want to make about that, but you know what to do. Go over to the question box and type in your question or comment. I'm happy to take that, and I'll have a look at it when it comes up. And then, of course, you've got D3 and D2, which is like a combination. But the important point about this model is that you need to be flexible, and you need to change your leadership style depending on who you're leading and you're depending on the situation that you're in. So those two variables are the critically important thing. All right, moving around the model now, we have continuous improvement. We have the ability to continuously improve what we're doing. So you should be questioning, and you should be encouraging people to question the way things are done in your team. And here's a template that might help you. So if you actually look at what things can be improved, here's a good place to start. So if you look in your work area and think about, well, where do we start? The first general comment I'd make is that the more time you spend on something in your team, the more open it should be for continuous improvement and innovation. Why? Because if you get a result in an area where you're investing a lot of time and energy, then obviously you're going to get a significant result because you've done something to improve it. So where do you start? Because a lot of people, when you say the word innovation, they go, oh, we're not Google, we don't do that sort of thing. Everything's open to innovation and continuous improvement. So how might we improve the quality of the goods or services that we deliver? That could be a good starting point. How might we reduce the time we spend on menial tasks and tasks that perhaps don't add value? How can we minimize or reduce the costs of doing business? How can we increase output? So how can we actually make sure that our output is higher than it is currently? And particularly if you're in an outdoor team, how do we increase safety? How do we make sure that we have a zero safety record? What sort of things can we look at to improve our safety or increase our safety? How might we meet our deadlines? And, all teams, of course, have got deadlines to be met. So what can we do to meet our deadlines? How can we increase or enhance our interpersonal cooperation with our stakeholders or other team members inside our organisation? What sort of things could we do that could improve that? And what sort of things could we do to streamline our systems and processes to make them more efficient and effective? So that template is a really good opportunity for you to start to look at continuous improvement. And I suggest strongly that you share that with your team, and you can then encourage them, instead of just saying, what sort of things can we do more effectively around here? Then you get these blank looks on your face. It's better to actually give them some guided pointers by going through a list of those 8 dimensions, and that will prompt some discussion around some of those things. So don't be afraid at your team meeting to have a conversation about that, or 2 or 3 over the course of a year, because I think that's the only way you'll get people to offer suggestions that might be worth looking at. Or again, it's one of the 5 conversations framework conversations that you can have one-on-one with each person. All right, moving right along. The next one is building on differences. And what I want to share with you there is this model that you'll see more so later on. And some of you might have done the team management profile. It's a fascinating profile. And if you're interested in doing it with your team, contact me online, and I can certainly arrange that. It's not part of this program, it'll be another program, but we can certainly look at doing that. But at the end of the day, the argument is that each of us have a certain role to play in our team. And what we've got to try and do as team leaders is to build on that role. So some people look back on the past to make sense of the future. Some people are very forward thinking. Other people are detail conscious. Because you work with your team, you know your team better than I do. And you know that there are certain characteristics about the way people approach the work they do in your team. The key for you is to try to harness that wherever you can. And we'll have more to say about that during our Lunch and Learn series. Now, flexibility and adaptability. Let's think about key decisions that are made in your team. Now, what I suggest you do, and this might be a good opportunity for you to have a conversation with your team, is you get a whiteboard out and you draw 2 lines down the whiteboard. And what I suggest you do on one of those, on the left-hand side, you write down or you ask people, what are all the decisions that we make in our team that have to follow a system? Now, you'll find that you'll get plenty of answers for that. So you write all those down, and then you go to the right-hand side and you say, well, what decisions do we make in our team, either individually or collectively, that require us to show initiative? In other words, there is no system, there is no process. We can actually decide for ourselves how we do things. Now, you'll find that will require a little bit more from you in order to get responses, particularly if you're working in a fairly bureaucratic organisation. So now you've got a list in the middle now, which is where it becomes interesting, because these are decisions that could either follow a system or a process, or you could actually show initiative. So it's sandwiched in between those two extremes. Now, this is where the problem occurs, because when people have got a choice between following a system and showing initiative, they will often choose to follow the system. In other words, what they're doing is they're playing it safe. Now, I understand why they're doing that, but sometimes that's actually not a good idea. Sometimes they actually need to show initiative. So if you discuss these things with your team members, it's likely that you'll come to some resolution and give people some psychological safety around where they can actually show initiative. So that's a very simple exercise that can go for 15 minutes and make all the difference in terms of clarifying your expectations around decision making in your team. The last one before we finish up today, because we're almost up to the top of the hour, is the continuous learning. Now, what I believe, and many of you are working in project-based environments, what I think is important is that is to use an after-action review. Now, what's an after-action review? Well, let me show you. Now, an after-action review is based on 3 key questions, and I'm going to run through them with you in a minute. Now, Peter Senge, who's a bit of a guru in the learning organisation, said that the after-action review, or the AAR, was arguably the most successful tool he's ever come across, which is high praise from someone like that. Any of you have had military training or would know people in the military, they use after-action reviews all the time, and these are called debriefs, another name for a debrief. Now, what can you do? How can you apply this in your team? Well, when you've completed something like a project or a task or whatever, you ask your team, what did we do well? Now, even if it was a disaster area, something actually went well. It always is the case. Then you ask them, what didn't go well? Now, even if it was a brilliant success, there's always something that can be improved. And the last question you ask is, what could we do differently next time? Now, this is brilliant. It works really, really well, and it only takes about 10 minutes at the end of something as a debrief. So what went well, what didn't go well, and what can we do differently next time? And you'll find that people will commit to those differences. And the argument is they'll commit to them because people don't argue with their own data. So, because they've come up with them, you can commit to them on that basis. All right, so that's it, folks, for me. Now, I'm going to give you some homework, obviously, because that's critically important. You're very quiet today. It's normally the case in our first Lunch and Learn, and I'm hoping that people warm up and feel comfortable to share perspectives and ask questions and use the technology that we've got today. So, I can understand that people might be just sitting back, observing how this is all going to play out, and who's this bloke? What's this bloke like? You're probably sussing me out and all that sort of stuff. Now, I want you to pick one of the characteristics of the 8 that I shared with you today. Just go back and have a look at the slide, because you'll get that today or tomorrow. Look at the slide, pick one area that I went through today, and then what I want you to do is to develop it. I want you to apply something that you learned today to build that characteristic. And I want you to do that because you will find that by doing that, not only will you build that characteristic, you'll also, as I said before, build other characteristics which are critically important. So I want you to have a go at it, and I don't want you to do all 8 because it's too overwhelming. You just pick one and off you go, and you'll find you'll get great results from it. So that's pretty much it from me, unless there are any questions, and it doesn't look like it. I will see you in a fortnight, and in a fortnight we're going to look at the 4 stages of team development, and in that I'll go through a process where you can actually determine the maturity of your team and what you need to do about it. So that's it from me, and I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm going to wish you a very happy weekend. Thank you and goodbye.